Will, and Andrew, who are welcome here.
Thank you. Andrew, firstly, congratulations on the book, which is an absolute masterpiece. I mean, there haven't been any State of the Nation novels for quite a few years, and certainly none that have achieved what you've achieved with it. For those who haven't read it, just as a brief summary, at its centre is Campbell Flynn, who is a kind of cultural critic, art critic, and the novel kind of tracks his existential crisis as he questions his reality and whether he's betrayed his roots. But spinning off from that, you go into all these different worlds so you're going into kind of corrupt retail tycoons, North London street gangs, Polish people smugglers, Russian oligarchs, the aristocracy, politicians, and it feels to me like you could get 15 different smaller novels out of this book. And I just wondered, when you started it, did you have a smaller canvas, or from the beginning was your ambition to write a State of the Nation social novel?
Well, it's great to be here. First, I'd like to say, it's such a thrill to be in Gstaad, but also to be able to speak to Will Smith. He won't say this, so I'm going to. Will is a writer himself, not only an author, but the man just won an Emmy for his adaptation of Mick Herron's Slow Horses. So,
thank you.
Round of applause. And so this is going to be an unusual discussion in that I'm not going to pretend I'm speaking to an ordinary person. I'm going to give us the benefit, as I see it, of having a proper back and forth. Will, I'm delighted to say, I'm totally honoured to be able to say, is adapting this book, Caledonian Road, for television. And so we'll be able to give you some absolute exclusive insights, I hope, into that process and what it's like to see a big State of the Nation novel be adapted. It's early days for this project, but we're already in quite a happy situation as far as interest goes, and we have wonderful producers. So we won't bore you with too much detail in a thing that you can't yet see. But in responding to the novel, I'm very much aware that this is a conversation Will and I are having at a professional level as well. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'll throw questions back at you from time to time. But I'll attempt to be a good boy and answer your first question and say that this was a social novel from the beginning. Sometimes in an author's life, and this is my 10th book, sometimes you realize that the material that you've been working with is sizable. The scale of it, not just not numbers of pages, but in terms of the life that it seeks to cover, that it is scaled up. And 10 years ago, when I really started writing this book in earnest, I was aware of something particular. And it was that for one reason and another, I had ended up in very odd social situations all my adult life. That I'd grown up, I was born in Glasgow, into a very working class environment. My mother was a school cleaner, my father was a carpenter. I went to the local comprehensive school in Ayrshire. We grew up in a particular kind of social experimental milieu. Then Thatcher happened, and the communities that we grew up in were sort of pulled apart. But then when I went to London, I immediately went into the cultural world as a young editor at the London Review of Books, and then the art world, and all those worlds opened up to me, the film world and others. So socially, I had this experience, but I had never really used that journey in a novel. And so Campbell Flynn began to be born in my head. The idea of this slightly posh, respected, well-known cultural historian, art historian, who lives very successfully in London. He's married to a woman whose sister's married to a duke. They're connected very deeply to the British aristocracy and the royal family and the business community at that level. And corruption is an element in his life that we don't see on the first page, but we very quickly come to see. I just knew how to write that guy by a certain point in my life. Now, let me be honest, I couldn't have written it even 20 years ago. I couldn't have written it in my 20s. I might have struggled in my 40s, but only when I was, as it were, approaching 50, did I know enough of the social worlds that are in the book. I had forced my way into this lunch with the Queen at Windsor because I needed to describe. Books are made of detail. It's not just random thoughts and observations. If you're going to describe a high-end polo lunch in the royal enclosure at Windsor, you better know what you're talking about, because those people, readers, they know, they'll hear it like like a dull note in the middle of a Debussy, study. They'll hear a dull note if it's wrong. So 10 years in the making, mainly researching and rewriting and visiting Russian oligarchs in their nightclub lairs. It's often very funny because in situations like that, as a researcher, you can't quite take out your notepad. When you're in an exclusive London club, you're in 5 Hertford Street or whatever, and with a bunch of oligarchs, and they're ordering obscene bottles of wine, and you want to take down the labels. And so I would often nip off to the gents and write notes on the sleeves of my shirts. So I had shirts that had, Chateau Talbot 1962, written up the sleeve, just detail. So it was always a social novel, right from the beginning.
And was it then, so it was active research that you were doing, it wasn't things that happened to you kind of outside of the process of writing the book that you thought you'd kind of pull into it when you kind of go to these places you were?
It's interesting that, Will, because as you probably know from your own work, some material is identifiable as where it's sourced. It comes from your life, or it comes from the source material if you're adapting something, or it comes from something you plucked out of the news. I mean, sometimes over this last period of Will adapting the book, when he was writing the pilot, he would come up with things amazing to me that aren't in the book. I mean, they just don't exist in the book. Where they exist is in your experience of life and in your imagination as a writer. That's proper adaptation. Now, there's 800 pages in this book. There's a lot of material to cover, but that doesn't stop you from, doing what we do and you do when you're writing a book originally, which is to draw on material from various sources. There was a woman called Catherine Freeman who died recently. She became a great friend of mine. She was 84. And I used to go to tea with her. She was very posh in a very English sort of way. And I realized early on in my friendship with Catherine that she was going to be the living model for the Countess in this novel. And so I told her, I said to her, there's a Countess in this book who lives in one of those ships that go round the world. You must have heard of these. I went on one of those ships for the Tatler. There you have an example of the material came from Catherine's childhood. She'd been married to a diplomat. She had a certain experience of going around the world. She was bohemian and upper class and English and well-educated, but also spirited and wonderful. But also I went on that boat for Tatler, and I went to all the lunches, I met all the people. So that was a source too. So you marry up sources from everywhere, just as you do. In adapting, you won't be cowed by whether it happened or not. I remember one day you sent me a message and said, it's amazing what's happening at these literary festivals.
Oh, yeah.
Where the authors are all...
Bailey Gifford.
Bailey Gifford, people who'd sponsored these literary festivals were suddenly being boycotted by the authors. Nightmare. Nightmare for the festival organisers, nightmare for the culture, but they were being boycotted, and you said, that's something. Now, that's not in the book. That's in Will's head. So,
yeah, but you then immediately sent me reams of texts, which was Campbell at a literary festival.
I started becoming...
Dealing with, you were kind of...
I was at the festival,
it was brilliant, yeah.
So I started being his reporter on the spot, and sending back material to him. That's, I think, that's the way a social novel gets written, is that you think like a reporter and you act like a reporter, but then in the privacy of your writing room, you're creating the music.
But you also are an exceptional journalist as well as an exceptional writer, and so do you think that gives you an advantage over other writers if they're trying to do a State of the Nation novel?
It makes you slightly fearless.
Yeah.
I know a lot, as do you. I know a lot of other novelists. I've grown up in this world. I published my first book when I was 24. So I've grown up in the industry. And I know a lot of very brilliant novelists who are terrible reporters. That's to say, they're frightened to talk to people. I've never been frightened to talk to people. And I'm unembarrassable in a social situation, which is incredibly helpful for a novelist. It's not that I'm socially valiant, it's just that I'm unafraid to ask a question. And if people don't want to say, then they'll tell me they'd rather not say. But I'll tell you something for free. It's much easier to do that with people in society, as it were, than it is to do it on the streets with street gangs. It's actually quite easy to meet a member of the royal family. It's easier to meet a member of the royal family than it is to see a waxwork of a member of the royal family at Madame Tussauds. You've seen the queue down Baker Street. Now, people who understand public relations are quite interested in meeting writers. The Russian oligarchs were easy to talk to because they're selling you a story. They wanted to give their side. So they have a public relations understanding of life. So for novelists to get access to a movie star, an actor, or an aristocrat, that's not that hard. You need to know how to deal with it once you're there. But the hard thing is people on the street. Because if you're my age, you know, a middle-aged white guy goes into street gang in London and says, "Hi." And they're like, "He's from the drug squad." Immediately. So that was quite tough. You know, I did a lot of wandering around North London. And to answer your question, it was the journalist in me, the young reporter that I used to be, was relentless. And I would just persist. I would stay on the spot. And even when people are saying, I don't want to talk to you, I've got nothing to say to you, you know, you're a danger to me. Because if you write about, you know, they're smoking dope and everything, and they think naively that I want to tell the world that they smoke dope. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in their language, what they say to each other. I need my characters in this book, the street gangs, to speak in an absolutely authentic way. So that's what I wanted. And eventually, by persistence, I broke them down, and they just allowed me to be around them.
And was that the same kind of group of people that you were going to for research
it was often
repeatedly,
the same
or would you go around different?
There's a place called Agar Grove in North London where I went a lot, you know, just between
Camden and
Islington. Yeah. And because that's near Caledonian Road, which is where the book is set, I just kind of hung around. I'll never forget how absolutely rejecting they were at the beginning. But thick-skinned as I am, I just found that quite funny and got through it because I was older than their dad. Much older than their dads, actually. And they thought, what is this? This guy wants information. But eventually they just thought, oh, this guy's actually interested in us. And so they couldn't resist telling you things, and they start acting out for you. And I heard them rap. And
do you know if they've read the book?
I've never been able to locate any of those boys again.
That's a bad sign.
I did locate, I know where two of them were, sadly. This is how the story ends. I won't spoil the book for you, but two of those boys that I had witnessed on the street ended up at the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey is the central criminal court in London. Capital cases, that's to say murder cases, huge. And those two boys were part of a gang who allegedly stabbed a young man to death, which is, knife crime in London is a huge thing, and it's a huge thing in the book. There is an element of the story, the backstory to some of these boys is that they're allegedly involved in a crime of that sort. So the next time I saw those boys I was in the Old Bailey for 22 weeks. I was in the Old Bailey. During lockdown, the courts in London were still open, so I used to go to the Old Bailey and go into the press box every day for, I think it was 20 weeks or something like that, yeah.
So
those boys were
just because it was their case?
Yeah, I wanted to follow their case, and unfortunately, they were indeed guilty, found guilty, and they both went down. But seeing those boys in court and knowing their backstory and their childhood, and I'd seen where they lived, and it was, as a novelist, the novel really comes alive at that point. That's where you realize you're able to deliver to your readers a social novel of proper intimacy, where in the way that, I mean, forgive the big names, but I use them because you'll know what I'm trying to say. But the Zola and the Balzac and the Dickens examples were in my head the whole time.
Yeah.
If Dickens wanted to describe, you know, an orphanage, because he was writing a book called Oliver Twist, he didn't guess what it was like in an orphanage. He went there. He smelled the stewed cabbage. He met Mr. Bumble. He talked to the boys. And he wrote reportage about it in preparation for writing his novel. The intimacy in Dickens is real. The social facts are real. He had met duchesses and dukes, and, you know, Lady Dedlock is a person not just in his head, but a person from life. So that's what I wanted to do.
So you're completely fearless then about going up to these young kids and approaching them and asking them about their backgrounds for research for the novel. Was there any nervousness about actually writing it in terms of the reception, in that, I mean, you've got a vast panoply of characters within the book, but you know, we live in an age where you're not supposed to tell other people's stories. I feel that is slightly kind of receding, as I think people realise that if that is pursued, we'll only be left with autobiography. But did you worry about that, or I mean, it feels like you're ready to defend it. Not that you even need to.
I think we should both answer that question. I'll go first, but it's something in television too. There is a pressure on us, or has been a pressure on us, to be mindful of the notion that other people own their lives, that we can't appropriate. Like if I was to suddenly glom onto your life and try to tell your story, even fictionalized, you might have recourse to say, well, hold on. You have no right to enter into a woman's imagination. I've tried to describe my daily routines, especially if I'm a different race from you, perhaps, or gender. I have to tell you without hesitation, I think that's nonsense. I think that the whole job of fiction, especially, and of writing more generally, is to appropriate other people's experience. And by appropriation, I don't mean steal. I mean impersonate, enter into. Use your empathy to go into human lives and human imaginations in a way that we were born to do. Human beings are the great social animal. We're not frogs, you know. We're not just born to eat and reproduce. We're born to imagine each other's conditions and empathize and somehow send our souls into each other and our imaginations so that we can, you know, exist in a way that people ordinarily are expected to, and other creatures are not. So the idea that we should bring a wall down, another wall, between us and say, I can't go where you are because you were richer than I am, or you were blacker than I am, or you know, you were a woman and I'm a man. Absolute nonsense, in my view, and I've resisted it from the beginning. Therefore, a social novel, as Dickens understood it, that's to say, he could write about, you know, the King of England eating his breakfast with the same energy and belief and empathy as he could write about an orphan poor child, you know, in the back streets of London. He gave himself that permission because it's his to take. And here's a difficulty, Will, I think. I don't know if you agree, but it's a common myth that we own the stories of our lives. I mean, you may think you own the story of your life, where you grew up, what your parents were like, your travels through the world. You don't actually own it. Neither in common law, neither in my submission, in ethics. It belongs to the world what happens to you. I could write your biography tonight, and you couldn't stop me. You could certainly take me to court if I libel you, or if I, you know, offend you. The legal protections are there for that, but you couldn't stop me trying to write your story and telling the truth. And I think that's something worth remembering with writers. We're here to describe each other. And I'm quite happily described every day by journalists or by other writers. That's their right. And so you're right to raise that because we've lived through quite an odd period. Now, can I ask you, in television, have you found that a pressure? For example, you've black characters in Slow Horses. Do you feel as a white man that you had to, as it were, have a conversation with yourself about whether you were allowed?
No, I think if I'd have created them, it might have been more of an issue, but because they existed in mixed book, and that's why I feel I have cover from you when you do the books. It doesn't make sense to me when people go, you know, in this adaptation, we've got to get a plethora of voices to represent the characters as in terms of the writing of it. Because I think, well, if Andrew or Mick can write the book on their own, why can't I adapt it? They've established the characters. Everybody loves the characters. Nobody had a problem with that. So why is it a problem for me to...
I have to say, I mean, it's a very interesting area. You're right to bring it up because we were ready for some resistance, especially given that I've got a trans character in the book. She's not there a lot, but they're not there a lot. But when they're there, they're very vividly, comical.
Ashley Joe.
Ashley Joe's
I was going to say,
comical.
the thing I love about what you do with them is that you completely respect their pronouns within the book, which it has this great effect of, it sort of gives them autonomy from you.
Yeah.
It's like they've told you how they want to be referred to. But then that doesn't spare her from your kind of withering gaze, as it were, at points. She could be as ludicrous as the other characters, and there would be a tendency from some writers, I think, if you had a character like that, to make them kind of morally above reproach and kind of, you know...
I think that's the thing, Will. I think if you're going to be a satirist, and there is a satirical element to this novel, it's meant to be a funny book about society, not just a dark portrait, although it might be that too. In the end, people have said so. But to go back to Dickens, he was a great social describer and a great reporter on the realities of English life, but he was also a hugely funny writer. Dickens is mainly comic, and that is the example I tried to follow. So, but if you're going to be a satirist, you need to be what I'd describe as an equal opportunity satirist. You need to satirize everybody. You know, you can't just satirize the people who aren't like you. Now, sometimes bad novelists, and even very good novelists like Evelyn Waugh, if I had an argument against Evelyn Waugh, it'd been that he editorializes too much for his own sort. So that he satirizes people who are, as it were, poorer than him, or less well-educated than him, or more ridiculous than him, or however he describes it. Was a good example of somebody who proselytizes for his own kind. I think that's a mistake. I think if you're going to be a satirical writer, you need to be willing to satirize the royal family, yes, but also satirize the kind of people who might satirize the royal family. People on the left come in for a bit of a rough ride in this book. It's one of the reasons we found it quite funny and amenable, I think, is that we're probably from that
From the
world.
left, but yeah.
Yes. And, you know, the left are very defensive. I mean, so if you accuse the left, say, of sentimentality and not liking jokes, they get very upset. But there is a case to be answered in English life as to why the right wing have the best jokes.
Yeah.
I remember raising this as a topic, and it was like throwing a bomb into a chip shop. You know, the whole of this socialist artistic community went crazy. They said, no, we're incredibly funny. I mean, how dare you? I said, you're not a great demonstrator of it now. You know, and that was always, I think, a live issue. I mean, you look back to the 80s when we had some left-wing comics, it felt quite novel.
Yeah.
You know, that Mrs. Thatcher was being attacked by people on the left who were funny. But I don't know that the tradition is as strong as it is on the right, because the right, this would be my explanation, the right feel that they can take the piss out of anything.
Yes.
Whereas we on the left are a bit like,
Don't go there. A bit more sensitive about it, yeah. So were you were prepared for pushback?
Yeah.
That didn't come, and was that?
And it didn't come.
But was that partly informed by your experience? Andrew wrote an incredible piece of long-form journalism about the Grenfell fire tragedy, and you got attacked from the left for that because you basically didn't tell them what they wanted to hear.
That's right. Well, that was a really instructive moment because without taking up too much of your time on this, you will know there was a huge fire a number of years ago, 8 years ago in London, in West London, where a tower block completely caught fire from a fridge on the 4th floor, and 79 people lost their lives in that fire. Now, immediately, it became a cause célèbre because it was a terrible event, but also the media all used it as a way of expressing their political position. So on the left, they decided this fire was caused by rich people in West London who lived in big posh houses, not caring enough for the migrants who lived in the slum dwellings. Now, for a start, I spoke to 300 people, including all the Muslim people who lived in the block. They didn't think of themselves as migrants, and they didn't think of themselves as living in a slum. So the left made an assumption about those people which didn't hold water. Further to that, when you actually examined the social housing policy of the council in West London, which happened to be conservative, I wouldn't have voted for them. But you have to be truthful as a reporter. When I interviewed them and looked at the records and looked at the history, Kensington and Chelsea Council had a better record of social housing and providing it and maintaining it than did Camden Council, where I live, which is Labour held, as you know. And I simply said all that in the piece and gave the history, and it was like somebody had just screamed an oath in church because they weren't willing to hear their argument, their moral argument, disputed. So, again, won't spend too much time on it, but it did actually give me an insight into how there was an angry world out there that didn't want the truth. We're living in a post-truth era. Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, those kinds of politicians depend on the idea that they can sell untruths to people who will readily accept them. The media were aiding and abetting them in that effort. And I think writers have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to stand at the center of that disaster and say, no, we're going to bring the facts. We believe in fact checkers. That's why it was so upsetting the other day when Facebook suddenly announced they wouldn't be having fact checkers anymore. Because without fact checkers, without writers, without novelists, without playwrights and poets, screenwriters, then we're in this miasma of unstable reality. Did it happen or did it not happen? What was the cause of this fire? And both on the left and the right, we were living through a period which affected all of us as dramatists, as novelists. How do you treat of reality in this era? We could talk about this all day in this room. Fiction writers, bizarrely, have become, ironically, the great upholders and fighters for reality. We're supposed to make shit up. But it's the authorities and the society that's making shit up. And the novelists that are coming, waving a flag for observable, provable, fact-checkable truth. That's where we are at the moment. So, writing a television show, writing a novel, we're in this conversation all the time. How do you deal with the fact that we're living in a society where people want to say no to the truth because it doesn't suit them? And we're off to the races with this now. All the books, I suppose, I'll write for the rest of my life will be dealing at some level with this disputable reality question.
Do you think that there's been a shift then in your approach to writing through the experience of having written this?
Oh, definitely, I'd say. I mean, I'm going to be intrigued to see how things develop with us, with the show, because can they handle it? I mean, in your pilot, you're raising questions of the most profound sort. Every single grouping across that whole social spread of aristocrats and street kids and media people and oligarchs and business people, you're raising questions about corruption, delusion, bad relationships that are hidden in society between the elected and the unelected. This is a big show about society. So what you're going to see is a lot of fearful reactions very quickly. You might not get as many of them as we would have 5 years ago. I didn't get them in the way that I thought. So you might be spared, we might be spared with the show too. I'm never sure if the audience for television is a little more willing to accept social criticism, because there's been a lot more of it in telly than there has been in the British novel. The British novel has been quite interior, there's been autofiction for quite a long time. As you started by saying, we haven't had a lot of social novel. Neither in France either, by the way, which really, I think, invented a way of doing the social novel right across the classes. I mean, Zola, in and out of workplaces and factories and brothels and schools, and just incredible sort of coverage of a society. But we haven't had that. But television's been better at it. I think you've gone into hospitals, you've gone into prisons. I can't tell you the last British novel that was in a prison. So.
And there was one area of research I wanted to ask you about specifically, actually, which is the garment factory in Leicestershire, which one of the Polish migrants, Bozadag, it's Jacob, isn't it?
Yes.
He's sent to work up there. And during COVID and lockdown, there were quite a lot of news articles about these kind of sort of sweatshop factories and how they were still going, and they shouldn't have been going during COVID. And frankly, they shouldn't be going outside of COVID. That they're exploiting workers, and there's no health and safety. It's a nightmare. And did you draw on those articles, or did you do your own research? Because you really put me in those buildings way more than the articles that I read.
Well, finally, when I realised that this young Polish migrant who'd arrived in England illegally was going to work in one of these sweatshops, I had that mental image that I offered to you earlier, that sentence, what would Dickens do? And what Dickens would not have done was just read an article from the New Statesman and then written the scene. I got my Adidas kick on, as I think of them, said to my wife, my long-suffering wife who's here, I'm going to Leicester to garment factories. And she says, what? And I said, yeah, I'll be away for a few days. And I went in a zipper with no contacts, went on the train to Leicester, went to Spinney Hills, migrant area in the north of Leicester. There's an old typewriter factory there. They used to produce beautiful imperial typewriters in the 1930s and 40s. Many of you will have owned, or your parents would have owned, an imperial typewriter, a beautiful machine. They were produced in Leicester, in this factory, which was now dilapidated, rat-infested, had old dirty bed sheets covering the windows. I went into that factory, and there was rats on the stairs, and it's described in the novel. That's all true.
But how do you get it? I mean, these are illegal.
It was very difficult.
How'd you get in?
It was very difficult. I was turned away from 3 or 4 doors, and I came and At first I thought I'd get in by asking for work. But then you get to a point in your life where you don't look like that guy anymore.
That's a compliment. That's good.
I promise you I did look like that guy in my 20s. I wrote a huge report for the London Review of Books when I was 22 about begging in London. It was a huge new thing, not new in historical sense, but it had come back to London, having been away in the 80s. And the people were begging in the tube stations, begging on the streets, the thousands of young and middle-aged and old people on the streets. And anyway, I wrote a huge piece for the London Review. I was 22, and I decided the only way to do this was go to live on the streets as a beggar. So I got my worst jacket, ripped it into, basically, fucked up my clothes, and messed up my hair and went and lived on the streets for 2 weeks. And I slept overnight in the hostels with all the old men, and, ate the soup that they were eating in the soup kitchen, and did a George Orwell, basically. George Orwell's famous example, and down and out in Paris and London. So 50 years later, did that. I got away with it. Nobody said I went down the South Bank with them from the bottle, did it all, and, wrote the piece. You can do that when you're 22. 55, not so much. They just look at you and they just know that you've been on the moisturiser for a while. You've been on the moisturiser too long, you've gone to the dentist a few too many times, you're just about holding up. So they can tell instantly. And I would go to these factory doors and say, I'd like to get, if you get any work, casual work, and they go, no. And then one of them, the guy said, can you work an overlocking machine? And I said, I think so. And I went in the machine. I've never worked a sewing machine in my life. And I sat down at this machine and immediately got an electric shock off the machine. And all these Pakistani women in rows were on these machines. And all their machines were fizzing. The plugs were bad, filthy plugs in the walls, and garments everywhere, and material, rolls of material everywhere. It was a fire hazard like you wouldn't believe. And I looked up and saw that the fire exit was completely blocked with boxes. So I was reporting even in the minutes before he rejected me. I was observing everything. And then...
Oh, so you were only in for a couple of minutes there?
I was in for a couple of minutes, and I said, I got a shock from the machine, and I stood up, and I said, I think I would do better making boxes for you. There was guys making boxes, and the guy got distracted and walked away, so I was in the factory then, and I was making boxes, and I just stayed for a bit.
Wow.
And during that time, I managed to speak to the other workers, and those workers, some of those women were working for £4 an hour, and let me just tell you something. I had worked out during my journey towards Leicester that the figures, if you ask the question, which social group are dying in the greatest numbers from COVID-related illnesses in the UK, the answer was Bangladeshi women working in garment factories in Leicester. They had no masks, they were passing garments and tools to each other all day, they were dying in huge numbers. These women. And so I was in the factory, and I just knew that the longer I stayed, the more detail I was getting. And so eventually, having stayed a few days, I was just drenched in this detail so I could write that scene. And it was like that. That's why it took 10 years, Will. Because it was like that with everything.
And you didn't tell them when you're asking them questions, you're not saying, I'm a novelist.
Sometimes I would be absolutely honest and say, I'm a writer, I'm just gathering facts. And people would go, oh.
They weren't suspicious in terms of if you're a journalist, you write an expose, the factory will be shut down, I'm out of work.
Not the workers, but any boss person.
So they would
immediately chase you out and say, you need to go. In any official situation, there are journalistic rules which I've always tried to follow. If I want to sit down with any of you or wanted in life, I immediately would say, I'm here as a journalist, I'm recording this. I'll check the quotes back with you. I mean, I know how to behave. I've written for the London Review of Books and the New Yorker for decades. I know the rules. But the rules for fiction writers are different. If I'm going to quote somebody as themselves, I would say, I'm a journalist, I'm a novelist, I'd like to quote you. But if it's more that I want the influence and the detail to inform an invented character, then I might not say, especially in conditions where they're going to stop speaking.
Yeah.
So you need to go a bit undercover.
And do you have an expectation that, a social novel such as this can effect any change, or is your kind of goal you just want to entertain and kind of inform the reader, or do you imagine it has a wider impact?
I think it's what Thomas said in his introduction, that literature's role is, if not political, it's deeply human and moral, in that it ignites in other human beings this ability to live their lives fully, more fully than they would have. I think if you read novels, the difference between somebody who reads novels and somebody who doesn't is absolutely obvious to me within 3 seconds of conversation. Because the person who reads novels is often in touch with people who aren't them, with ideas that aren't native to them, and that's what novels give you. And I think that there's this growth from within for people who read. And that's our purpose. So I wouldn't say I wanted to change the law. I mean, it's great when you occasionally can contribute to the raising of consciousness or awareness, the need for political change. If a novelist can do that, that's fantastic. But that's not something that's in my head. But what is in my head is the notion that I can bring scenes like that back and give an account of life back to my readers that they otherwise would never have had. That hadn't been in a newspaper, that hadn't been in a television documentary. It's in my novel. And I'd like to think that you sort of, let me say, you widen the parameters for your readers. The sense of what's possible, what's true, what's important can change because of what you're trying to do. And along the way, they're being entertained and having fun and laughing and everything else, I hope, with a big social novel. But there is this ambition, I think, to as the great American poet Wallace Stevens said, literature helps you to live your life. That's the fundamental hope.
We definitely achieved that. I still think about those women in the garment factory for the book, and Mr. Hazari, the guy in the wheelchair.
Yes.
All of that. It's just beautiful, because you managed to achieve what I love in all fiction and drama, where you just feel you're dropping in on those people's lives for that moment, and they have a life either side of the moment you're writing about. There was one other real-life incident I wanted to ask you about, which I think, without giving away too much about the book, but there was a tragic incident to do with migrant workers and people smugglers that happened probably 5 or 6 years ago. And it's very directly kind of used in the book, and I just wondered when that happened. How long after that happening did you decide you were going to use that?
I covered that trial too.
So you covered that, and so you took from that.
Let me just explain to our audience that it was a now famous case where above 30, mostly Vietnamese migrants into the UK were found very tragically dead in the back of a container that arrived in Essex. It was driven, the container had been mounted onto a lorry having come off a container ship from Zeebrugge. And they were driven at both ends by young Irish hauliers. And it turns out there was a huge corrupt network of hauliers running from Ireland who were delivering usually 15 at a time in the back of a container. This is the kind of grim information you gather when you're looking at cases like this. 15 human beings can survive in a journey from mid-France across the English Channel into England overnight. There's enough oxygen in the back of those containers to do 15. You go above 15 and people are going to start struggling. There was 30 people. They were all dead by the time that the ship was in the middle of the English Channel. And I got the counter for this is grim. There's a gauge, a temperature gauge inside those containers, always. It's just standard. And I got the gauge and could tell, I could watch through the hours the temperature going up and up and up, and then at a certain point in the evening, it started to drop. That tells you a terrible, sad story. That they were fighting against heat and exhaustion and asphyxiation, and then they all started to die and the temperature went down. So you could tell exactly where in the evening they died. That kind of detail, grim as it is, it opened up the terrible tragedy of those young people. They were mainly young Vietnamese who'd paid $10,000 each to get out of Vietnam and into England, some of them via Russia, Germany, France. And I got closer and closer to the story, and then eventually I covered the trial of the Irish boys and the Albanian men who had mainly been responsible for these deaths. And it was a hugely modern, terrible, tragic story. But at the centre of my social novel, you could begin to see the connections with all the other parts. One of the things that Will did this brilliantly, I have to say, in the pilot, which you'll hopefully eventually see, I did this is good to discuss because it gives you a little insight into the technical differences between writing something for the page and then Will reimagining this material for the screen. I held back the relationship between the migrant workers and the drug dealers, that's to say the street gang boys and the migrant traffickers. I planted it in the reader, but the reader has to work it out slowly that there is a relationship between these people financially. You deal with it in the first episode just by showing one of them hand another one an envelope, I think, or speak to him through a window.
Yeah, he gives them the money.
He gives them the money. That's amazing. When I saw that, I jumped out of my skin because I realized that you did something that I couldn't do because it would have been too over-descriptive, too suggestive on the page. But visually, I mean, there's no editorial, there's no, oh, by the way, these two people are connected in a financial way and we'll show you later in the series how. It's just one gesture, passes an envelope through the window of a van. That's the fascination for me as I watch this grow, because you're redoing problems that I felt I dealt with in the way that was right for a book. And I think they broadly were right.
Absolutely, because it's like a mosaic where you're setting up all these different worlds and then you bring it all together.
But it presents you with a problem, which is, how do I let the viewers know
that
that there's something going on here? Because readers can have things in their head, they can revisit it, whereas visually, you need a visual clue, right? I mean, is that the problem often, that you're like, how am I going to visualize this for the viewer? How do I give them the narrative in visual terms?
Well, you always want to try and do it in visual terms so it's not expositional in the dialogue.
Yeah.
That's the thing you're always fighting, is having people
explaining away.
Explaining it, and it just felt fun to sort of do a condensed version of what you do in the book, which just show all those connections, but just to sort of give a picture that in the first episode that they're all connected. And but I've only probably got in 20% of the characters in that first ep. I haven't even got the Krupa's mother and all of those characters.
It's interesting to me to watch it happen because, like you, I've grown up on what I think of as the television novel now. The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, Succession, of course, Slow Horses, which was a novel, but some of them were not. But on television, the experience you have watching them, what we used to call box sets, is like the experience of a novel in that the characters really spread their elbows.
Yeah.
You get your scenes are longer. You give them more time to be characters. Whereas in television, it used to be much choppier.
Story. Which is important.
Yeah.
But you don't want. I always want the story to come from the characters and not feel they've got the plot and they're putting the characters into it. And that's what you.
Well, that's one of our big questions that I know we can explore across the day. We have Angie coming up, and this question of somebody asked me actually before I come up here today, how do you build a story? Do you start with the story, or is it the characters? And for me, I have to say, it's always the characters. Once you know who a person is, then you can start to work out the kinds of things that might happen to them. Not the same things happen to everybody. Sometimes life throws a thing unexpectedly at you. If you're all in a bus that falls off a cliff, then social distinctions don't matter. But storytellers enter the story or create the story around the notion of that character, where they've been, who they are, how they speak, what decisions they were likely to make, how that would impact on others. So it's always character. And that's one of the things that, if anything, has been emboldened in me as a writer by loving good television. I've got stronger on character, I would submit, than I was 10 years ago. And when I wrote my first 3 novels, I think the characters are there, but I don't think they're as well defined as they might be were I to do it now.
And do you still think about the characters in Caledonian Road? And
I do. I sort of live with them. It takes a long time to stop dreaming about them. I was living with them. It's
10 years.
It's a bonkers thing to do with your life, writing a book, can I just say? It's an insane thing to do with your life, where life's hard enough without adding things in. And that's what you do as a novelist. You're with the people you love, living your life, and you're with your family. And, and it's Christmas Day, and you're walking around washing dishes and thinking about a garment factory in Leicester and things that people are saying to each other. That's your life. As a novelist, you're inventing all the time. You're having a bath and you should be sort of, smoking a cigarette and dreaming about, something pointless. Instead of which you're plotting. You're saying if that character was to meet that character in the old Chinese medical place in Gray's Inn Road, then that would give me, you're always working. As a novelist, you're working even when you're asleep. I would wake up in the morning and start taking notes, thoughts that had occurred in the night, encounters that had come in dreams between my characters, and only now are they beginning to fade away.
Really?
I feel that they're owned by other people now. When I see this big book, and I remember it as just 800 blank pages, I can't quite believe it. I just can't quite accept it.
How did you do
was
it?
responsible.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm not being cute when I say I don't really think I was responsible. It was like a dream I had. That book was a fever dream that lasted for 10 years. And you've told me that I went to Leicester and reminded me that I must have done. That's a fever dream too. It's all magic.
How did you bring it all together at the end? How did you stop? Because it feels like you were kind of just writing and finding new ways, places to go. But when did you? Was it when you felt like you had, for instance, like the migrant story that felt like an end, and so
that really pulled it together?
And then you're like, I mean, did you before that happened? Did you have an end? Did that replace another?
I had an end in the. I mean, I won't say what it is because I'm not going to spoil anything for people, but. That last image in the book, which you know very well, was always there.
So Campbell's arc was always there.
Campbell's arc was always there. I knew what was going to happen to Campbell. What I didn't know from the very beginning was what was going to happen to all the people around him. I knew that the connections were going to become thrillingly intricate. Thrilling even to me, because I didn't know yet. And let me not pretend that it's not a thrill being the author, because I go to my desk some mornings, I turn on the lamps, I bring a mug of tea, I sit at my desk, dying to know what's going to happen. That can happen to you too. You're as humanly susceptible to this surprise. And then said, I've solved it. And I've got a big board full of cards. And suddenly on an old typewriter, I'll type the new card. And the new card might be, Campbell's expecting to get all the money from the Countess's will. Then something happens. I'm not going to say what. Type it on a note, and I'll go up to my board and I'll take the pins apart and start saying, where is it in the structure? If it happens there, then the next beat, there's a reaction to that, and the reaction then dictates what happens on the summer holiday. So like you, I'm always thinking, what episode, how does that make sense within
the whole?
The whole.
But so at that stage when you're kind of working out all the beats across it, was there an earlier stage where you're just writing one of the character stories, like it'll just be Campbell and Milo, or it'll just be...
No, I write a plan.
So you write, so that it's all, it wasn't like you kind of wrote 10 novellas and then merged them.
No, not at all. I don't think I could do it that way. I know some people do, but for me, the plan, I've got a felt board. I couldn't say what size it is, but it's probably 6 feet by 4 feet, a big felt board. And I have one of them in each of our places. So my wife and I have a place in Scotland. I have one there, I have one in London, and these cards are the Bible to me. The plan for the book, and I'll augment it and change it and deepen it. There'll be draft after draft of this board. But the book is on the board. Just as you maybe, I don't know if you, in writing rooms, if you create whiteboards.
I write on whiteboards.
Yeah.
I've done that, yeah.
It's the same thing. Like you could come in at an early stage. I was joking with you. Once I saw what Will could do in adapting the novel, I said the only downside was I was going to have Will beside me in future while I was writing books to see what should really happen. And, if you came in, you would understand this from the whiteboard, from the felt board, exactly what I was trying to do. Because you've got the experience of that and you understand structure in advance of the actual written thing.
Yeah.
So, I always do. I'm in the middle of doing one now, and I've got a new board on the go for the next book. And in my head at the moment, I know exactly how the next book ends. And I know the sort of heartbreaking and I think very delightful relationships that exist in the next book. But from next week, when I finally get back to London and settle back into life, or when I come back from India, I'm going to get the board supreme as I think of it. It will be type.
And is that before you start writing it?
Yes,
Right.
because I can then, I feel it's like music, you know. If you have the score in front of you, I mean, you can be the loveliest pianist in the world, and you can actually know it. But having the music there, it's a bit like having the board there. I can look at the board, and it frees me up. It relaxes me. It stops me from feeling.
You can go off from it. And,
you know, yeah, I can go off from it, but I know the board will bring me home. You know,
Yeah.
So I can play the music and get the sentences and shape it and rewrite them and keep looking at the board. It helps me perform.
Mm-hmm. And is the next book, is it another social novel? And if not, will you do another social novel?
It's not a social novel in this sense. It's not a big novel. It's a shorter novel. But something happened in the late 1970s. My mother was, as I think I mentioned, she was a school cleaner. And it turned out the janitor in that school was an incredibly powerful terrorist for the UDA in Ireland. And they arrested him one day. Flying squad came to the school. I was there, and I've never written about this relationship. He was having a relationship with one of the other women, and so a family at the centre of this incident in 1979 is the story of the next book. It's a kind of supernatural love story. Something very strange happened in that school, and it's a much smaller book. It has a social element, but not in this sense. I'm going to write another one.
You are going to do another, and
Yeah.
will it be a sequel?
There's going to be 3. Yeah, there's going to be there's a second one which is going to have a politician at the centre of it, and at the
But
moment,
some of the same characters.
some of the same characters will
Right.
reappear. It's called Great Smith Street.
Great.
Great Smith Street is a street in, as many of you will know, in Victoria, where a lot of politicians live. It's quite a posh street. So the novel's called Great Smith Street,
Okay.
and there's an artificial intelligence element to this novel, and it really does, I think, it's a part 2, but it's not that a lot of the characters come over, but the vibe comes over.
Right, so like The Wire season 2, where it
Wire
starts
season
somewhere
2,
else and you can bring...
and then there's a third one later.
And what's that going to be?
The acting world comes into that, and
Oh.
so I'm really describing 10 years worth of work here, but I shouldn't do that.
How far are you into the second one then?
It's in my head, quite developed. I can
Okay.
see what that's going to be.
So this is Caledonian Road is the first in the
I
trilogy?
think it'll be a London trilogy in the end.
That's incredible.
I didn't tell you that
You didn't
already.
tell me that. I'm so excited.
So I want you to cancel your life.
Yeah,
Please.
that's 3
if you don't
seasons.
mind.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think at this point, should we open it up to questions from the floor? Now we've taken it to the trilogy.
Given what you said about
There's a mic coming down. I think it helps for the people watching online.
Thanks. Given what you were saying about the importance of factual accuracy and the social realist element and research, what for you is the value of fiction? Why not just turn this research into narrative non-fiction, for instance?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you, it's something that I think about all the time. And my answer is this, that fiction denotes not just the invented, it describes, if you like, a quality of humanness, that we all have a fictive element even in our real lives. We have to in order to be living properly. Dreams, for example, which we mentioned, are fiction. You know, there are aspects of our moral relationships with people which are fiction. Think about how you talk to your children, the way that you use ideas and imagination in order to protect them, look after them. Fiction is a crucial part of our DNA, and it's not that it's lies or that it's untruths, it's that it's a way of thinking and connecting to the material of the world and the imagination, even the supernatural realities. You know, there are things we don't really know the answer to, that fiction helps us get closer to. I will always write novels because there are things that reality can't quite reach yet. Even in a beautiful relationship or in a marriage, there are things that reality wouldn't describe that fiction can. The business of the human heart. So I could write a true account of all these characters, but I don't know that I could convincingly reach into their hearts in the way that I'd hoped to with this novel. There are moments where a character is just alone, and their aloneness is fully animated, that I can go inside their thoughts. The thing we learned from the great American novelist Henry James is that thoughts are events. Feelings can be actions. So when you say action is I lift that glass and throw it on the floor, cause, effect, action, okay? We know what that is. You did a thing. You caused a thing to happen. That's action. But what if I just thought of doing it? That's an event too. You might say to me, last night you said that you kept thinking about smashing glasses into the floor. What's wrong with you? Are you feeling upset? Why this aggression? That means that thought was an event. It was an action, albeit in the confines of your head. I don't want to be too philosophical in our lovely morning here, but that's where we go with this business of fiction. It's essential. I mentioned Wallace Stevens, the American poet, before. He talked about the supreme fiction. And what he meant was reality is a supreme fiction. This building that we're in feels real. It feels solid, but it was invented by somebody. Somebody drew it into existence, and then other men and women made the room, made the lighting, made the windows, manufactured the reality. So the manufacturing of reality for me is what life is all about. So fiction is your greatest companion in getting inside, getting to the interior of what human existence really is all about. More questions?
Do you view yourself as a Scottish writer, an English writer, a world writer, and in what way do you think nationalism or nationality is important as a writer?
I've always thought of myself as a Scottish writer because when I was young, my favourite writer, and still to some extent, was Robert Louis Stevenson. And Robert Louis Stevenson described himself beautifully as having a strong Scots accent of the mind. And what he meant was not unakin to what we've just been discussing with this gentleman, that there's a way of thinking which has a bit of a national stamp on it. You know, I think it'd be fair to say that there's a French way of thinking about certain things, you know. There's a Swiss way, probably, of going at a problem or not going at a problem. You know, human character shouldn't be over-defined tribally by our differences, but we do have some differences, and they're entertaining to conjure with, I think. You know, I don't think of myself for a second as an English writer, because I don't think like an English person. I'm too oppositional in my thinking. What I mean by that is that there's a very Scottish propensity to establish a thing as being true, and then immediately feeling moved to examine whether the very opposite isn't also true. So two-mindedness, or as they would say, duality, is a great Scottish trope. That's why I would argue, the great masterpieces of human duality were written by Scots people. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the Confessions of a Justified Sinner, James Hogg's masterpiece. Yep. Great, or Peter Pan, which is also a story about duality, being a boy and not being a boy, being human and not being human. I would say that it's a full answer to your question, but you know, I felt Scottish from the minute I started thinking, and certainly from the minute I started writing. I mean, I feel Scottish in every sentence I write, even if it's not about Scotland. You know, it's just a kind of DNA question almost. Today's Burns Night, I have to remind you, the 25th of January. So the national poet, Robert Burns, is celebrated all over the world today. And I can remember on walking to school, this is the kind of kid I was, quite sad, you know, practicing Robert Burns's poetry as a way of sort of dealing with the cold. So I would be walking through, and I still remember it now. I'll give you a couple of lines. Since it's Burns Night, you can have a bit of Burns in your ears to enjoy your day with. There's a great epic poem of his, which I'll spare you the lot of. We'd hear for 15 whole minutes if we did it. But it's called Tam O'Shanter. And it describes a man in Scotland in the 1760s about to leave a pub and being very drunk. It goes like this. As chapmen billies leave the street, and drouthy neebors meet, as market days are wearing late, and folk begin to tack the gate. As we sit, boozing at the nappy, getting fou and unca happy, we think na, and the lang Scot smiles, the mosses, waters, slaps and styles that lie between us and our hame, where sits a sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brews like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. This truth found honest Tam O'Shanter, as he frae air yin night did canter, all there, whom ne'er a tune surpasses, for honest men and bonny lasses.
I'm not sure we're going to top that.
Anybody who needs that explaining to them, I'll be around for the rest of the day.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.